Sometime in the late ninth century, a Norse longship slices through the frigid North Atlantic mists. Its crew, guided by legend and the flight of ravens, makes landfall on a primordial volcanic island. This is a landscape of black sand, steaming vents, and stark mountains that would come to be known as Iceland. But as they explore this new world, they find something that doesn't belong. They find no native people, no signs of a permanent settlement, but rather the ghostly traces of a presence that came before them. Left behind in the solitude are strange and unfamiliar artifacts, Irish books with their distinctive lettering, finely crafted bronze bells, and the curved wooden staves of Christian holy men. These men were called the Papar by the Norse, and their existence has framed a medieval historical mystery that has now gone on for over a millennium. The bedrock of the Papar legend is found in a handful of medieval texts. The earliest potential hint comes not from Iceland, but from Ireland itself, where the Papar are thought to originate from. Around 825, an Irish monk and geographer named Dai Cool wrote De Mensura Orbis Terrae, or in English, On the Measurement of the World. In it, he describes Irish holy men who, around the year 795, had resided on a northern island he calls Thula, a place where they experienced the midnight sun. While he never explicitly names Iceland, his account establishes the crucial plausibility of such voyages long before the Norse arrived. The first definitive Icelandic source, however, was written nearly 250 years after the settlement began. Between 1122 and 1133, the priest and historian Ari Thorgilsson, known as Ari the Wise, penned a text known in English as the Book of the Icelanders. His account is brief but clear. Christian men, whom the Norse called Papar, were on the island when the settlers arrived. They departed, he writes, because they refused to live alongside heathen people, leaving behind their Irish books, bells, and staves as proof of their origin. This narrative was later repeated and solidified in the Book of Settlements, a more extensive work compiled in the 12th and 13th centuries. This text reaffirms that the Papar were Westmen, a Norse term for Gaels from Ireland and Scotland, and lists their abandoned artifacts as the primary evidence. A critical examination of these sources, however, reveals that they may not be independent confirmations of these Irish monks, but rather a literary echo. The Book of Settlements account is widely seen by scholars as being derived directly from Ari's earlier Book of the Icelanders. More compelling is the theory that Ari himself may have based his story on Dai Cool's much older, geographically vague text. If so, the entire literary tradition of the Papar in Iceland could rest on a 12th century Icelandic priest's interpretation of a 9th century Irish account that never even mentioned Iceland by name. This transforms the narrative from one supported by multiple sources into a single influential thread that was repeated over time. While the texts are debatable, the motivation for such a journey is not. The story of the Papar is entirely plausible because of a powerful spiritual movement in early medieval Ireland known as Peregrinatio pro Christo, or Wandering for Christ. This wasn't missionary work or pilgrimage in the modern sense. It was a radical form of ascetic renunciation. Inspired by biblical calls to leave home and family to follow God, these monks sought a lifelong voluntary exile. They believed that by abandoning their kin and homeland, they could achieve a purer state of devotion, not held down by any worldly connections. For these men, the vast, empty North Atlantic became their desert, a place of extreme isolation where they could imitate the highly influential early Christian desert fathers of Egypt. This quest for a desert in the ocean led them to establish hermitages on impossibly remote sea crags throughout the region. A voyage to the ultimate isolation of Iceland wasn't a leap of faith, but the logical conclusion of their spiritual quest. Notably, the medieval Irish were an adept seafaring people and possessed the technology for medium to long-distance travel. The powerful ideology of peregrinatio provides a robust why for the story, even if it doesn't constitute proof of what actually happened. If these Irish monks were real, they should have left some trace. Yet the search for concrete archaeological evidence has been frustratingly inconclusive. The most logical place to look, the island of Papey off Iceland's east coast, has yielded nothing. Multiple excavations have found only remains of later Norse settlements. The most interesting clues come from a series of man-made caves in southern Iceland, which contain numerous simple crosses carved into their soft stone walls. Some researchers argue that the style of the oldest carvings resembles those found in the Celtic world around 800 AD. However, these claims are highly speculative. The crosses are simple in design, impossible to date physically, and located in caves used for centuries. Even place names like Papey are potentially unreliable. Norse settlers arriving from Scotland and Ireland were already familiar with the term papar. They may have simply applied the name to remote locations that looked like places such monks would inhabit, without any ever having been there. If we assume for a moment that the papar were a real historical community, the question naturally turns to what happened to them. According to traditional accounts, they were unwilling to share their solitude with pagan Norsemen, so they simply packed up and left. That said, this account was written down well after Icelandic people had been Christianized, and these Irish monks leaving may have been a way to boost their virtue. That is to say, the later Icelandic people felt a significantly greater spiritual connection to the Irish monks than they did their own pagan ancestors. However, other fates are just as likely and have also been suggested. It doesn't take a genius to figure out that a small, celibate, all-male community would be demographically unsustainable. Not to turn this into a biology channel or anything, but they simply couldn't possibly add to their own numbers. Without new recruits, they would have simply gone extinct within a generation or two, perhaps before the main wave of Norse settlers even arrived. However, it's also possible that some remained and assimilated into the new Norse Gaelic society, a population that already included many Christians from the British Isles. Some of these Christians were early Viking converts, but a good number of them weren't in Iceland willingly. These monks may have seen it as their duty to provide some comfort and care to these Christians who were also in a new land. Finally, while the sagas portray a peaceful exit, the historical reality of Viking encounters with Christian communities was often violent. The possibility of conflict, forcible expulsion, or just straight-up elimination can't be dismissed. Notably, we're not sure how large this community was, and it's possible that a very small Viking raid could have entirely eliminated the community in one action. If this was the case, it makes sense that the subsequently Christian Icelanders would have little reason to emphasize the destruction of a Christian community upon the arrival of their ancestors. The papar exist in a liminal space between verifiable fact and foundational folklore. The spiritual drive and technical capacity for Irish monks to reach Iceland is undeniable, yet the physical evidence remains elusive. Further, the literary sources that tell their story are products of a later, Christianized age, possibly written with the specific goal of crafting a Christian origin for the nation. This theory suggests, in essence, that these monks served the narrative purpose of Christian Icelanders, to explain why Iceland was really a properly Christian land after all. In this narrative, there's only a brief pagan interlude before the Icelandic people return to the quote-unquote true faith of the island. Whatever the case, this is a medieval historical mystery that will only be fully cracked with further archaeological finds. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy just reminding you to like and subscribe, and also to share this video. Also, don't forget to check out the video podcast, Lazy Chill History, by clicking the link in the description. In the Great Hall of Winchester Castle hangs a colossal artifact, a silent testament to a centuries-long obsession. It's an 18-foot diameter tabletop, weighing over a ton, its surface divided into alternating green and white panels. Inscribed in gold leaf are the names of legendary knights, including Lancelot, Gawain, Galahad, and Percival. At its center blooms the iconic red and white Tudor rose. At first glance, it seems to be the very round table of King Arthur, but a closer look reveals a fascinating deception. The face of King Arthur, seated in the place of honor, isn't that of a 6th century leader, but a 16th century monarch, King Henry VIII. And the table itself, though painted during his reign, wasn't crafted in the mists of Camelot. Modern scientific evidence indicates that its timbers were felled around 1275 during the rule of Edward I. This object, then, isn't a relic of a mythical age, but a powerful symbol of how deeply that myth was woven into the fabric of real-world power. It stands as a physical embodiment of a compelling question. Why did the legend of King Arthur and his fellowship become so potent that for 3 centuries, Europe's elite dedicated immense wealth and effort to reenacting it? The answer lies in the spectacular, costly, and often dangerous festivals known as Round Table tournaments, where literary fantasy became a vital tool of political theater. Before a single knight could don a persona, the legend itself had to be forged. The Arthurian myth that captivated the medieval world was not an ancient story handed down intact, but a literary construction built over more than a century. It began in earnest around 1136 with Geoffrey of Monmouth's History of the Kings of Britain. This transformed Arthur from a shadowy warrior of Welsh folklore into a magnificent king. A generation later, in 1155, another work added the most crucial piece of furniture in Western literature, the Round Table itself. According to the lore, it was introduced as a clever device by Arthur to prevent quarrels, ensuring no knight could ever claim a seat of precedence. In essence, the knights of the Round Table were all equals with one another, at least in terms of optics. Further writers took the martial court and imbued it with the sophisticated ideals of chivalry and courtly love, transforming Arthur's knights from mere warriors into spiritual seekers. They embarked on quests not just for earthly glory, but for holy relics like the Grail, their adventures becoming allegories of honor, temptation, and piety. The power of this narrative lay in its central symbol. In a rigidly hierarchical feudal society, the table's circular shape was a revolutionary concept, representing equality, unity, and a camaraderie that transcended simple vassalage. This fellowship, bound by vows of honor and loyalty, became the ultimate model for the great chivalric orders that would flourish across Europe. Some storytellers even gave the table a divine origin, claiming Merlin had modeled it on the table of the Last Supper, lending it sacred authority. To understand the unique character of the Round Table tournament, one must first appreciate the evolution of the tournament itself. It underwent a dramatic transformation from a brutal game into a regulated, theatrical sport, creating the perfect stage for the Arthurian fantasy to be performed. The earliest tournaments, which emerged from northern France in the 11th century, were little more than full-scale mock battles. These tournaments could also be used to generate both prestige and profit. The legendary William Marshal, who rose from a landless knight to regent of England, was said to have bested over 100 knights in just a few months on the tournament circuit. As time went on, these tournaments developed from these mock battles to what we generally think of today, that is to say, one-on-one combat and jousts. These tournaments eventually grew to be a sort of theater, where knights could show off not just their martial prowess, but also their chivalrous conduct. For instance, while the earliest tournaments were almost gladiatorial combat between high-born men, later tournaments were designed with safety and theatrics in mind. The Round Table Tournament was the ultimate expression of this new theatricality. It was a specific, highly stylized subgenre of the tournament that blended martial sport with immersive, myth-based entertainment. A round table was more than a series of jousts and one-on-one combat. It was a multi-day festival of feasting, dancing, and pageantry, all meticulously designed to imitate the legendary court of Camelot. The first recorded event of this kind was held not in England or France, but in Cyprus in 1223 to celebrate a knighting ceremony, and the fashion quickly swept across Europe. These events would be recorded wherever the matter of Britain had become popular, in an area spanning from the Iberian Peninsula to the Holy Roman Empire. Its defining feature, and what set it apart from a standard tournament, was the adoption of Arthurian personas. Attending knights would assume the names, and sometimes the heraldic arms of famous figures, including Lancelot, Gawain, Tristan, and Percival. Essentially, they immersed both themselves and the audience in a live-action fantasy. This element of role-playing elevated the event from a simple competition to a performance. Central to this performance was the presence of ladies and the ideals of courtly love. Once a literary trope, courtly love became a key part of the tournament's script. Knights would publicly declare they were competing for the honor of a chosen lady, wearing her token tied to their helmet or lance. The lady, in turn, became the inspiration for the knight's valor and the ceremonial bestower of prizes, transforming the violent contest into a romantic drama. This adoption of personas served a sophisticated social and psychological purpose. Medieval aristocratic society was a web of fierce rivalries and complex feudal loyalties. A standard tournament could easily inflame these tensions, sometimes devolving into a real battle. The round table format, however, provided a crucial safety valve. By requiring participants to play the roles of a legendary unified brotherhood, it allowed real-life rivals to compete fiercely, but within a fictional framework. After all, everything could be explained away that it was just theater, with Gawain jousting against Lancelot. By the 16th century, the great age of the tournament was drawing to a close, brought down by a confluence of social, military, and economic pressures. As the events became ever more focused on pageantry, the costs spiraled out of control. Fabulously expensive armor, extravagant costumes, and multi-day feasts made hosting or even participating exclusive to the wealthiest monarchs and nobles. At the same time, the tournament's original purpose, as training for combat, had become almost entirely obsolete. The rise of professional infantry armies equipped with longbows, pikes, and, decisively, gunpowder weapons had rendered the armored knight far less effective on the battlefield. The specialized skills of the joust no longer translated to victory in actual combat. The Round Table Tournament was a critical, glittering phase in the process of embedding the concepts of chivalry, honor, and fellowship deep into the Western cultural psyche. For 3 centuries, it was the stage upon which a literary ideal was brought to life. It was a place where the elite of Europe could, for a few days, inhabit a world more noble, more romantic, and more orderly than their own. History remembers January 2nd, 1492, with a single powerful image, a king handing over the keys to his city, and with them, an entire civilization. On that day, Abu Abdallah Muhammad XII, known to the Spanish as Boabdil, rode out from the Alhambra Palace to surrender Granada to the Catholic monarchs Ferdinand and Isabella. This act marked the end of the Reconquista and nearly 8 centuries of Muslim rule in the Iberian Peninsula. The story that follows him out of the city gates has become one of history's most poignant legends. As his mournful party reached a mountain pass, Boabdil is said to have looked back one last time at his lost paradise and wept. It was then that his mother, Aisha, supposedly delivered a withering rebuke, telling him he's weeping like a woman for a kingdom he couldn't defend like a man. But this story, likely a fiction crafted by the victors, obscures a much deeper mystery. The real disappearance of Boabdil wasn't in that single tearful moment, but in the quiet fading of his life from the historical record. Following the surrender, Boabdil wasn't immediately cast out of Spain. The geopolitics of the Mediterranean at the time included the extremely powerful Ottoman Empire, who had taken an interest in the fate of the Muslims in Spain. Because of this, the terms of capitulation were initially very generous and granted him a fiefdom in a mountainous region south of Granada. He settled in, trading the gilded halls of the Alhambra for the quiet life of a country lord, occupying his time with hunting. But this fragile peace was short-lived. His life was upended by the death of his wife, a profound personal tragedy that seems to have been the final catalyst for his departure from Iberia. Yet personal grief was intertwined with political reality. Boabdil's continued presence in Spain was a liability for the new highly Christian state, a living symbol of the old regime who could become a rallying point for discontented Muslims. The promises of religious freedom made in the Treaty of Granada were already beginning to erode. His departure, therefore, was politically convenient for Ferdinand and Isabella. This effectively nullified the original treaty, giving them a pretext to break the last remaining elements of Islamic power in Iberia. In October 1493, Boabdil sold his lands back to the crown and sailed for North Africa, vanishing from the shores of Europe forever. He arrived in a Morocco that was itself in the throes of a political crisis. Boabdil settled in Fez, the capital of the Wattasid Sultanate, a Berber dynasty whose grip on power was tenuous at best. The Wattasids were fending off Portuguese incursions on the coast, while being challenged from within by a rising power in the south, the Saadian dynasty. They built their legitimacy on a platform of zealous defense of the faith against foreign invaders, a narrative that painted the Wattasids as weak and ineffective appeasers. In fact, the Wattasids had signed a treaty with Spain in 1485, promising not to aid Granada in its war. In this volatile environment, Boabdil was a prestigious but deeply awkward guest. He was a symbol of the lost glory of Al-Andalus, but also a symbol of defeat at the hands of the very Christians the Wattasids were accused of placating. As a king who had surrendered, he represented the opposite of the militant ideology fueling the Saadian rise. It's no surprise, then, that he was likely marginalized at court and seems to have lived a quiet life, far from the political fray. He was a ghost from a fallen kingdom, a political footnote in another kingdom that was fighting for its own survival. It is here, in the labyrinthine alleys of Fez, that Boabdil truly disappears. His final years are a historical black hole, with chroniclers offering wildly different accounts of his fate. This confusion is the heart of the mystery, a set of competing narratives that have left his end uncertain for over 500 years. The most influential theory comes from the 17th century historian Ahmad al-Makari. Though writing more than a century after the fact, he claimed to have spoken with Boabdil's descendants. He asserted that the exiled king lived a long and quiet life in Fez, passing away around 1533 at about 75 years of age. A competing version, from a 16th century Spanish chronicler, gives Boabdil a more dramatic end, claiming he perished in battle around 1536. Under this theory, he was an active field commander in the conflicts between the competing Moroccan dynasties. However, this theory is largely considered discredited, as it's unlikely that a man of almost 80 years old would have been in the field, even in a commander role. Further, this theory is also discredited by the fact that Boabdil's uncle actually did perish under these circumstances, and it's likely the chronicler had his wires crossed on the facts. An even older theory, now largely dismissed, placed his passing much earlier, in 1494 in Algeria. The sheer range of dates suggested in the sources, ranging from 1494 to as late as 1538, indicate the extreme uncertainty about Boabdil's fate. This historical cold case has inspired a modern quest. In recent years, a research team believes they've located Boabdil's final resting place beneath a derelict mausoleum on the outskirts of Fez. Using ground-penetrating radar, they've identified what appear to be human remains and tombstones, consistent with the burial of a sultan alongside a holy man. Notably, this project is currently stalled by bureaucratic hurdles, but the team hopes to one day excavate the remains and perform a DNA analysis. It turns out that some of Boabdil's descendants converted to Christianity and married into the Spanish nobility. As such, this testing could prove that the remains in Fez are those of the last king of Granada. The port of Genoa in May 1291 was a maelstrom of controlled chaos. It was the heart of a maritime republic at the zenith of its power, a city whose merchants and sailors were considered the undisputed kings of the seas. Amidst the usual clamor of loading and unloading, a spectacle was unfolding that drew the gaze of hardened sailors and wealthy merchants alike. Two galleys, the Sanctus Antonius and the Allegrancia, were being provisioned not for a routine trip to Alexandria or Constantinople, but for a 10-year journey into the unknown. The contemporary chronicler Jacopo Doria, a man with deep connections to the city's elite, captured the mood perfectly. He recalled that all eyes in the city, from commoners to the wealthy elite, had their eyes on these galleys and the men behind them. At the helm were two certifiable mad lads, the brothers Vandino and Ugolino Vivaldi, who intended to sail out past the Pillars of Hercules and find a sea route to the Indies. To understand the Vivaldi's attempt to get to the other side of the world, one must first understand the allure of spice, and that for European traders, the spice must flow, no matter what. In the 13th century in Europe, commodities like pepper, cinnamon, cloves, and nutmeg were very literally worth more than their weight in gold. They weren't merely flavorings for the bland medieval diet. Rather, they were essential preservatives, key ingredients in medicine, and the ultimate status symbols for the wealthy elite. This lucrative trade was controlled by a long chain of middlemen. Spices traveled from the East Indies along ancient sea and land routes. They passed through the hands of Arab and Venetian merchants, who could mark up the price by 1,000% or more before the goods ever reached Genoa. For a maritime power like Genoa, being cut out of the most profitable legs of this journey was a source of constant frustration. The fall of Acre in 1291 turned this frustration into a full-blown crisis. With the traditional routes through the Levant now once again controlled by hostile powers and subject to a papal ban, the Genoese needed an alternative, and they needed one fast. The Vivaldi's stated objective, as recorded by Jacopo Doria, was simple: just sail to the source of the spices. This was a commercial venture at its core, a bold attempt to bypass the old monopolies and establish a direct, Genoese-controlled route to the source of the world's greatest wealth. Notably, this approach had worked before, and Genoa had established trading rights and colonies as far away as the Black Sea earlier in the 1200s. Yet the trip may not have been solely about profit. The presence of two Franciscan friars on board indicates a dual purpose, blending the classic European expansionist motives of God, glory, and gold. The mission was to open new markets for Genoa and win new souls for Christendom, or at least, that's how the brothers had to frame it to achieve maximum patronage for their bold journey. The Vivaldi brothers sailed with a surprisingly modern understanding of the globe's shape, but a profoundly medieval conception of its contents. Contrary to the persistent myth, educated people in the 13th century didn't believe the earth was flat. Since the time of the ancient Greeks, they knew it was a sphere, and scholars had even made reasonably accurate estimates of its circumference. The intellectual challenge wasn't the planet's geometry, but its geography. European cartography at the time was a strange hybrid of the practical and the theological. For navigating the familiar waters of the Mediterranean, sailors relied on remarkably accurate charts, which detailed coastlines, ports, and sailing distances with empirical precision. But for the world beyond, they had the Mappa Mundi. These world maps weren't tools for navigation, but theological diagrams meant to illustrate the history of salvation. They typically placed Jerusalem at the center of a disc-shaped world, with the Garden of Eden to the east of the Holy City. The known continents of Europe, Asia, and Africa were surrounded by an impassable ocean. The unknown peripheries were populated by a terrifying menagerie of monstrous creatures drawn from classical and biblical lore. There were dog-headed men with faces on their chests, giants, dragons, and all sorts of creatures which were believed to inhabit these regions. These world maps would place legendary realms, like the kingdom of Prester John, alongside somewhat accurate placements for ports in Arabia or South Asia. And as you can imagine, a multi-year journey that involves relying on Prester John keeping the forces of the dogmen at bay may not be entirely grounded in reality. This reveals a fundamental tension at the heart of their attempt. They were attempting a modern project, the charting of a global trade route, using a medieval intellectual toolkit that blended fact with faith and commerce with mythology. The expedition was a serious, high-stakes venture backed by the pinnacle of Genoese society. The brothers Ugolino and Vadino Vivaldi weren't rogue adventurers, but experienced merchants and navigators from a noble and wealthy family with deep seafaring traditions. Their primary financial backer was Tedisio Doria, a member of one of Genoa's most powerful ruling families. It was Tedisio's nephew, Jacopo Doria, who would ensure the voyage was immortalized in his city's official annals. The two galleys were crewed by approximately 300 sailors and accompanied by the two previously mentioned Franciscan friars. This was an expedition launched from the very center of European maritime power and expertise. For all the expertise of its crew and the wealth of its backers, the expedition's fate was likely sealed before it ever left port. The 13th century galley was the most advanced ship in the Mediterranean, a marvel of naval engineering designed for its specific environment. It was a long, slender, and shallow draft vessel propelled primarily by oars, built for speed and maneuverability in coastal combat and trade. These very characteristics made it disastrously unsuited for the open ocean. These galleys had an extremely low freeboard, meaning their decks were less than 4 feet above the water at their lowest points. While this was fine for the calm Mediterranean, this made them dangerously vulnerable to being swamped by the large rolling swells of the Atlantic Ocean. They also didn't have sails equipped to deal with the strong and unpredictable winds found off the African coast. Their greatest liability, however, was their power source, the massive crew of rowers. A galley could carry up to 150 oarsmen, all of whom required vast quantities of food, and most critically, water. Yet the ship's narrow hull had severely limited space for provisions. A galley could typically carry only about a week's supply of water, forcing it to hug the coastline and put ashore almost every night to rest and resupply. This operational model was simply unsustainable for a voyage down the desolate Saharan coast and into the vast, unknown expanse of the South Atlantic. The technology that had given Genoa mastery of its inland sea was precisely the technology that guaranteed its failure in the ocean beyond. The ambition of the Vivaldis had tragically outpaced the capabilities of their engineering. Our only firm contemporary account of the Vivaldi expedition comes from the annals of Jacopo Doria. For centuries, his chronicle was known only from an incomplete manuscript, leading some historians to doubt the voyage ever happened. But in 1859, a complete copy was discovered, containing the crucial passage that confirmed the story. They made a brief stop in Majorca to take on expert pilots who had sailed in the Atlantic before passing through the Strait of Gibraltar. From there, they sailed south along the coast of Morocco. The last known point of their journey was a place Doria calls Gozora. This was likely not a specific port, but a general region, probably corresponding to Cape Nun. This is a landmark located in present-day southern Morocco that for centuries had been considered a point of no return for both European and North African sailors. After they passed Gozora, Doria writes, quote, "No certain news has been received of them." He ends his entry with a simple, poignant prayer that captures the moment the Vivaldi brothers stepped off the edge of the known world. Quote, "May God watch over them and bring them back safe and sound." The Vivaldis vanished into a void of information, and into that void rushed rumor, speculation, and myth. For over 150 years, their story evolved from a contemporary mystery into a foundational legend of exploration, with each new account adding another layer of fantastical detail. The first whispers of their fate came decades later, driven by the poignant search of Ugolino's own son, Sorleone Vivaldi. He's believed to have traveled as far as Mogadishu in modern-day Somalia, chasing rumors of his lost father. Unfortunately, the credible historical sources are quite light on what he actually accomplished on this trip, but don't worry, we do have an account that involves Sorleone's journey. Around 1350, a semi-fantastical travelogue called the Book of Knowledge, penned by an anonymous Spanish friar, provided the first narrative of what might have happened. The author claims to have learned that one of the galleys was wrecked in the Sea of Guinea, while the other sailed on to a city called Menem in Ethiopia. In Ethiopia, the crew was captured and held captive for a time before eventually being released. The friar even claims to have met Sorleone in an African city called Magdasor during his quest. This account, while geographically confused and intertwined with the popular legend of Prester John, established the core elements of the Vivaldi myth. There was a shipwreck, a capture, and then survival in a distant African kingdom. The most tantalizing and most suspect piece of evidence emerged much later. In 1455, a Genoese explorer named Antoniodo Usodimare, sailing in the service of Portugal's Prince Henry the Navigator, wrote a letter to his creditors back home. In it, he made an astonishing claim. While trading near the Gambia River in West Africa, he had encountered a man who spoke the Genoese dialect. He claimed to be the last descendant of the survivors of the Vivaldi expedition. Most modern historians, however, view this account with extreme skepticism. His likely intended purpose was to impress his financial backers and elevate the importance of his own discoveries by linking them to a famous Genoese precedent. It's a fascinating story, but it's almost certainly a self-serving fabrication rather than a genuine clue. Despite these colorful legends, the modern scholarly consensus is far more prosaic and tragic. The Vivaldi expedition was almost certainly lost at sea, its end coming not long after it passed Gozora. The combination of the treacherous waters of the Atlantic, the currents off the African coast, and the unsuitability of their galleys for ocean travel created a recipe for disaster. Notably, the wreck of the ships has never been recovered, and given that galleys hug the coast, there's always the possibility that one or both of the ships is found. These ships would be fairly easy to identify because they ultimately went where few, if any, other 13th century galleys had ventured. Ultimately, the voyage of Vandino and Ugolino Vivaldi was nothing short of a catastrophic failure. They didn't reach the Indies, and they didn't return. The Vivaldi brothers stand as tragic but essential pioneers who asked the right question at the wrong time. They simply didn't have the technology to meaningfully pull off the journey. Personally, I have to wonder if the Vivaldi brothers could have known, even in faint outline, the legend of Hanno the Navigator. If you haven't seen my video on him, or you're unfamiliar with the story, he's the Carthaginian who centuries earlier had sailed down Africa's Atlantic flank to the Gulf of Guinea and back. If any rumor of Hanno's voyage was bouncing around western Mediterranean ports, the idea of a coast-hugging, bold Atlantic run might have lodged in their minds as a precedent. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy, just reminding you to like and subscribe, and also to share this video with your friends and family. Also, don't forget to check out the video podcast, Lazy Chill History, by clicking the link in the description. In a small courtroom in Savigny, France, in the winter of 1457, a judge had delivered his verdict. A sow, the primary defendant, was condemned for the slaying of a 5-year-old boy. Her 6 piglets, her co-accused, were acquitted, and justice, of a sort, had been served. But the story wasn't finished. In the quiet that followed the sentence, the piglet's owner, a farmer named Jahan Bailey, stood before the court. The judge had restored the 6 young animals to him, but on one condition, that he give bail for their future good behavior, which Bailey refused. He formally renounced his ownership of the piglets, declaring that he couldn't be held accountable for any future crimes they might commit. The legally innocent but socially tainted animals were declared vacant property and forfeited to a local noblewoman who was willing to ensure they would behave. This strange, unsettling epilogue is perhaps the most revealing moment in the entire affair. It forces us to look past the immediate absurdity of a pig on trial and ask a deeper set of questions. Why would a farmer reject his own valuable property, and what crime could be so profound that it stained not only the perpetrator, but also her young, legally exonerated offspring? The answer lies at the heart of the medieval worldview. This was a world struggling to impose a human system of justice and order onto a universe that often seemed random, brutal, and terrifyingly chaotic. The trial of the Savigny sow was not an act of collective madness, but a desperate, highly ritualized attempt to make sense of a senseless tragedy. In December 1457, a sow and her 6 piglets brutally attacked a 5-year-old boy, and despite the best efforts of the townspeople, he perished, and the porkers were taken into custody. In the context of a 15th century French village, this was a horrifying but not entirely unthinkable event. Unlike today, medieval pigs often roamed freely through the streets. They were a source of food and wealth, but their size and proximity to humans, particularly unattended children, also made them a potential danger. What followed, however, was not a simple act of vengeance. The community didn't immediately slaughter the offending animals, but instead, they turned to the law. The sow, her 6 piglets, and their owner, Jahan Bailey, were formally arrested and taken to jail to await trial. A month later, they were brought before a local judge in a proceeding that had all the hallmarks of a human criminal case. The court records note the presence of 3 lawyers, 2 for the prosecution, and remarkably, 1 who appears to have been appointed for the defense of the pigs. 9 witnesses were called to give evidence about what happened. The witnesses established that the sow was the clear aggressor and the so-called ringleader in the attack. The role of her piglets was far more ambiguous. While they were found covered in blood, no one had actually seen them take any direct hostile actions. They were heard squealing, though no one could interpret what these noises actually meant, and if they were an attempt to egg on the assault or stop the attack. This detail became the crux of the case, and after consulting with experts in local customary law, the judge delivered a split verdict that would be unthinkable today. The sow was found guilty and sentenced to be hanged from a gallows tree by her hind legs, a customary form of execution for such crimes in the region of Burgundy. Her piglets, however, were acquitted, and the reasoning given sounds surprisingly modern. The court cited their youth, the corrupting influence of their poorly behaved convict mother, and the lack of direct evidence as mitigating factors. They also acknowledged that the noises made by the piglets could have been an expression of sympathy for the human boy. This nuanced verdict reveals the trial's true purpose. Had the goal been simple retribution, all 7 pigs would have been given the bacon penalty. Rather, the trial was using the sophisticated intellectual tools of jurisprudence to parse degrees of culpability exactly the same way it would be done for humans. Further, it applied concepts of diminished responsibility, youth, and parental influence to non-human actors. The court wasn't just butchering a pig, it was constructing an elaborate narrative of justice. The Savigny case was a surreal episode, but it was far from unique. For centuries, from roughly the 13th to the 18th century, animal trials were a remarkably common feature of European justice. These proceedings, however, were not monolithic. They operated within a structured system, divided between 2 distinct legal realms, the secular and the ecclesiastical. Secular courts, like the one in Savigny, held jurisdiction over individual domesticated animals, pigs, bulls, horses, and donkeys. These creatures lived alongside humans and were seen as members of the community, subject to its laws. Ecclesiastical courts, on the other hand, dealt with a different class of offender. Their defendants weren't individuals, but entire collective groups of pests and vermin, rats, locusts, weevils, caterpillars, and flies. Their crime wasn't against a person, but against the community's livelihood, typically the destruction of crops or the intentional spreading of disease. Seen as creatures outside the human domain and subject only to God's law, their punishment was spiritual rather than physical. After a formal trial, they could be cursed or solemnly banished from the district. The records of these trials are filled with astonishing cases. In 1522, a brilliant French lawyer by the name of Bartholomew Chassenet made his name defending a group of rats accused of destroying the barley crop of a region. When his clients failed to appear in court, he successfully argued that a single summons was invalid, given his clients were an entire class of animals in a region. When a second summons was issued from every pulpit, and the rats still failed to appear, Chassenet made his masterstroke. He argued that his clients couldn't be compelled to attend, as the journey was fraught with peril due to the presence of cats in the region. Since the court was unable or unwilling to remove all cats from the region and guarantee his client's safe passage, the case was dismissed. While the official records don't recount how Bartholomew Chassenet was paid for his work, I personally like to assume he had a lifetime supply of cheese morsels. In a more bizarre and sinister case in 1750, a female donkey was accused of quote-unquote unnatural behavior with a human male. But the townspeople, including the parish priest, came to her defense, signing a certificate attesting to her virtuous character and gentle nature. The court was moved, and while the man was eliminated, the donkey was acquitted on the grounds that she was a victim of violence, not a willing participant in the crime. But let's get back to the medieval pig trial for a second. To the modern mind, we necessarily have to question why a medieval society would go through the trouble of giving a pig its day in court before hanging it. The answer isn't simple. It lies in a confluence of theological, philosophical, and social anxieties that shaped the medieval world. No single explanation suffices, but together they reveal a society desperate to find meaning in a world that often provided none. The most foundational explanation is theological: the need to restore a divinely ordained cosmic order. Medieval society was built upon the concept of the great chain of being, a rigid hierarchy descending from God down through angels, humanity, animals, and plants. In this worldview, a pig acting out aggressively to a human wasn't just a tragedy. It was a complete metaphysical crisis and a violent subversion of God's plan. The trial was a public ritual designed to symbolically reassert the proper order, to demonstrate human dominion over the animal kingdom and restore the universe to its rightful balance. This was complicated, however, by an ambiguous understanding of the animal soul. Drawing on Aristotle, theologians like Thomas Aquinas argued that animals possessed a sensitive soul for instinct, but lacked the rational soul that gave humans moral culpability. In this view, an animal could not truly form criminal intent. Yet popular folklore and the daily experience of living with animals led many ordinary people to attribute to them a degree of reason and will. This ambiguity created a legal gray area, and the court could proceed as if the animal were a rational agent. In essence, everyone agreed to put aside the thorny theological issue about whether animals possessed free will, and just treat them like they did. After all, in a world where people interacted with animals all the time, everyone knew that even animals of the same species had wildly different temperaments. On a more pragmatic level, the trial served as a powerful sociological tool. The public butchery of a sow, attended by other farmers with their own pigs, was a terrifying and unforgettable public service announcement. It was a warning aimed squarely at the human owners: control your animals, or the state will, and you will bear the catastrophic economic loss. Notably, it's unclear if any pigs themselves were brought to the hanging, though under the logic of the time, it's a distinct possibility that unruly swine were brought to be scared straight. Naturally, the next logical question is why these practices ceased. The practice of trying animals faded with the dawn of the Enlightenment, first in metropolitan areas, but gradually spreading out over all of Europe. During this period, animals were reduced to a machine-like status by philosophers. Unlike theologians, who had to accept that animals at least had some semblance of a soul, Enlightenment thinkers viewed them as completely unthinking. Animals had no moral agency whatsoever, and so the courtroom doors closed to beastly defendants. Interestingly, centuries later, we're now exiting the era of animals as unthinking automatons. For example, gray parrots have been noted to have human-like levels of consciousness, and potentially even a very rudimentary sense of morality. Under our ever-evolving understanding of animal intelligence, it's possible that we will one day see the medieval approach to animal justice as humane, and our own time as barbaric. Imagine Christopher Columbus in the late 15th century hunched over his charts and books, dreaming of a westward route to the riches of the East. His desk is likely cluttered with the usual references: astronomical tables, maps, and perhaps a copy of Marco Polo's account of his travels. But alongside them, another far stranger volume lies open: The Travels of Sir John Mandeville. This was a book that didn't just describe the Great Khan's court. It described islands populated by dog-headed men, headless barbarians with faces on their chests, weeping crocodiles, and the literal fountain of youth. And yet, for Columbus and generations of Europeans, this fantastical guide was treated as a serious work of reference, a reliable window into the world beyond their borders. How did this book, written by an author who almost certainly never traveled farther than a well-stocked library, become one of the most influential texts of the Middle Ages? The book opens with a disarmingly straightforward promise. The narrator introduces himself as Sir John Mandeville, born in the English town of St. Albans, who set out across the sea in 1322. His stated goal is simple and deeply resonant for a 14th century audience: to write a guidebook for pilgrims wishing to visit the Holy Land. This framing was a stroke of marketing genius, and it immediately tapped into the profound piety of the era and a lingering crusader nostalgia. By positioning itself as a practical and spiritual guide to the center of the Christian world, the book secured an immediate and devoted audience. The author's strategy worked beyond anyone's wildest expectations. Composed in Anglo-Norman French sometime between 1350 and 1370, The Travels became an instant sensation. Its popularity was explosive and far-reaching, and within a few decades, it was translated from its original French into nearly every major European language. The most popular translations were in English, Latin, German, Italian, and Spanish. For a secular text in the age before the printing press, its dissemination was staggering. Today, around 300 manuscript copies survive, a number that dwarfs the remains of many other medieval works and testifies to its immense readership and cultural penetration. A key reason for this phenomenal success was the book's ability to satisfy a deep-seated spiritual yearning. The journey to Jerusalem was a life's ambition for many medieval Christians, but it was also a dangerous, arduous, and prohibitively expensive undertaking that few could ever attempt. The Travels offered a powerful alternative of a mental pilgrimage, where readers could imagine they were seeing all the sights they had heard about in church. But the book's appeal went far beyond the purely devotional. It presented itself as a comprehensive, up-to-date encyclopedia of the known world, a magnificent piece of popular science disguised as a personal adventure. The narrative seamlessly blends the Pilgrim's Guide with a broader geographical and cosmological treatise. Mandeville offers a clear and intelligent account of the roundness of the Earth, which, contrary to popular belief, was well known at the time. However, he went a step further and confidently asserted that it's possible to circumnavigate the globe, a radical idea for even a highly educated audience. The narrative is broadly divided into two parts. The first half is a relatively sober and believable account of the journey through Europe to Constantinople, Cyprus, Egypt, and finally the Holy Land. This section follows recognizable pilgrim itineraries and is filled with the kind of details a contemporary reader would expect. The author describes Christian relics with reverence, such as the crown of thorns and pieces of the true cross, and provides seemingly practical information about the Sultan's court in Egypt. By leaning heavily on specific, verifiable-sounding details, the author meticulously established his persona as a trustworthy, pious, and experienced traveler. After all, there were people in his readership who had legitimately conducted these journeys, and basically, it all added up. This initial part functioned to lull the reader into a state of comfort and suspended disbelief, building a foundation of credibility that the rest of the narrative would depend on. Having earned the reader's trust, the author begins to pivot, but the transition into the world of marvels is masterfully gradual. The shift isn't a sudden leap, but a slow pecking apart of the wooden dam of credibility by woodpeckers of mistrust. As the narrator's journey moved beyond the relatively well-documented Holy Land into more remote lands, the wonders of the encounters become progressively more pronounced. In the second half of the book, the narrative confidently leaves the constraints of the Pilgrim's Guide behind and blossoms into a full-blown encyclopedia of the marvelous. This is where Mandeville ventures into the lands of legend. He describes his service in the army of the Great Khan in Cathay, which is what Europeans called China at the time, offering detailed accounts of the emperor's immense power and wealth. He documents travels to the fabled Christian kingdom of Prester John, a figure of immense fascination in medieval Europe, depicted as an unimaginably rich and powerful monarch. However, these accounts are strikingly normal compared to what would come next. He tells of the Blemmies, a country of headless people whose eyes and mouths are located on their chests. He describes the Cynocephali, a surprisingly intelligent and reasonable people who happen to have the heads of dogs. We meet the monopods, who possess a single enormous foot, which they use to shield themselves from the sun's intense rays. And of course, there's Amazonia, the legendary kingdom composed entirely of fierce warrior women who live without men. For Mandeville's audience, these people and creatures weren't necessarily pure fiction. They represented the strange but plausible possibilities that might exist at the far edges of God's creation. Beyond these humanoid monsters, the book is a veritable catalog of natural and supernatural wonders. Mandeville describes the phoenix, the mythical bird of Arabia that lives for 500 years before building its own funeral pyre. He claimed that in certain regions, people live in the shells of giant snail-like creatures, in a state of comfy harmony with nature. He recounts the legend of the vegetable lamb of Tartary, a marvelous plant that grows a living lamb as its fruit, which then produced cotton. Most audaciously, he claims to have personally visited and drunk from the Fountain of Youth, which he claims to have located somewhere in the Indochina region. To a medieval reader, these monsters were far more than just sources of entertainment or horror. It was a worldview where the material world was seen as a text written by God, and every creature was imbued with symbolic and moral meaning. Perhaps the most obvious metaphorical being was the phoenix, a creature who in the medieval view was clearly a symbol for Jesus Christ. A medieval person could cite the works of John Mandeville and say, well, there's proof of the phoenix, a creature who clearly affirms faith in the divine order. Monsters represented the boundaries of the known world and the seemingly infinite creativity of the divine. They often served as allegories for human sins, or, conversely, as examples of unexpected virtue. Mandeville's treatment of these creatures is often surprisingly complex and ambiguous. For instance, the dog-headed men serve to teach the reader that they have no right to judge the creations of God. Simply put, if the Creator wants to create a rational and kind dog person, it's not your place to question it. For all its influence, modern scholarship has reached an unequivocal consensus on one thing. Sir John Mandeville, the Anglo-Norman knight, never existed in any capacity. He was a fictitious persona, a literary device created by an author who was, in all likelihood, a brilliant compiler who never traveled beyond perhaps the Holy Land. Extensive searches of contemporary English records have failed to turn up any evidence of a knight by that name who undertook such a journey. The book is not a memoir of actual experiences, but a masterful work of literary construction, a collage assembled from the writings of others. Historians have been able to construct some of the potential sources of the travels. His primary source for the travels in Asia is likely an account by the real-life Franciscan missionary Friar Odoric of Pordenone. He had traveled extensively in Persia, Central Asia, and China in the 1320s. Mandeville lifts entire sections from Odoric's sober descriptions, but then often embroiders them with fantastical details. For his descriptions of the Holy Land in Egypt, he relied heavily on a travelogue by a German knight named William of Boldensal. For general knowledge and wonders, he cribbed heavily from the massive 13th century encyclopedia Speculum Mundi by Vincent of Beauvais. But all this leaves us with the question of who the author, or perhaps more accurately, the compiler, of the travels of Sir John Mandeville was. As for this portion of the medieval mystery, a definitive answer remains elusive. The most long-standing theory points to a man named Jean de Bourgogne, a physician living in the city of Liège. According to a local chronicler, this physician confessed on his deathbed in 1372. However, there's no meaningful evidence for this other than the word of another man about this confession. Of course, the deceased man couldn't ever dispute this so-called confession, and some have speculated that the chronicler may have simply wanted to generate attention to himself. After all, the next best thing to being John Mandeville was being the person who cracked the identity of who one of the most famous medieval literary figures was. Others have suggested that it was a Flemish monk who had spent a substantial amount of time compiling travelogues into realistic anthologies. Under this theory, the travels are in essence the work of a bored monk who just wanted to have some fun and let his imagination run wild. Whatever the case, in the end, the travels of Sir John Mandeville isn't remembered as a reliable guide to the geography of 14th century Asia, but it is an unparalleled and indispensable map of the 14th century European imagination. It reveals a worldview in which the lines between the empirical and the allegorical were blurred, where geography was inseparable from morality, theology, and myth. For Mandeville and his audience, the world was a symbolic text, filled with moral lessons from God. Every creature, no matter how monstrous, and every custom, no matter how strange, had a place within this divine symbolic order. It showed these medieval Europeans that the world may be scary, but it wasn't an evil place as was commonly believed. The narrator frequently observes foreign, non-Christian societies and finds in them virtues that he believes are lacking in his own Christian Europe. Mandeville ultimately presents a feel-good world of incredible diversity, but one in which all people, regardless of their customs or appearance, are ultimately human and part of God's creation. Of course, this imaginary map had a very real impact on the physical world. Returning to Columbus for a second, we can see how the ripples of this bizarre medieval book helped pave the way for the Age of Discovery. Also, as a bit of an aside, let me know in the comments if you're interested in me posting a video where I read segments of the travels. It'll have to be from an older public domain translation, but honestly, that might add to the charm of it all. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy just reminding you to like and subscribe, and also to share this video with your friends and family. Also, there's a new YouTube feature that allows you to hype up a video to help increase its reach, so please do me a huge favor and get on that hype train as well. Also, don't forget to check out the video podcast, Lazy Chill History, by clicking the link in the description. On the night of February 13th, 1021, the powerful ruler of the Fatimid Caliphate, Al-Hakim bi-Amir Allah, one of the most influential men in the medieval world, prepared for a journey. At 35 years old, he was the master of a vast empire that stretched across the shores of North Africa to the heart of Syria, with its glittering capital in Cairo. But this was no royal procession. and in the final years of his reign, the caliph had adopted a life of stark asceticism. He had long since abandoned the gilded silks of his ancestors for simple woolen robes, and preferred the humble gait of a donkey to a royal war horse. His nocturnal excursions into the Mukaddam hills just outside the city had become a regular solitary ritual, a time for meditation and withdrawal from the empire he commanded. That night, he rode out from Cairo's southern gates on his favorite donkey, Kamar, accompanied by only 2 attendants. The chronicler Yahya of Antioch, one of the contemporary sources to detail the event, recounts that a group of men from the Banu Qurra tribe approached the caliph, likely seeking money. Al-Hakim, known for his unpredictable generosity, dispatched one of his servants to escort some of the men to the treasury. Shortly after, he dismissed his final attendant, riding on alone into the darkness of the hills, and he was never seen again. For a few days, his absence caused little alarm in the palace. The caliph was known to disappear for short periods. But as the days stretched on, concern mounted into panic, and a large search party, composed of palace staff and loyal soldiers, was sent out to retrace his steps. Near a monastery, high on a hill, they made their first grim discovery. His loyal donkey, Kamar, had his front legs slashed by a blade, and he was unable to walk. The searchers followed the tracks of 2 men leading away from the animal until they reached a small pond east of the town of Hulwan. There they found Al-Hakim's robes, pierced with multiple dagger-like stabs, yet strangely there was no blood, and the robes were still fully buttoned. Of the caliph himself, there was no trace, and his body was never found. The evidence left behind was a mystery in itself. The slashed-up donkey and stabbed garments pointed to a violent end, yet the neatly fastened clothes seemed to contradict a chaotic struggle. To understand the mystery of Al-Hakim's end, one must first grapple with the enigma of his life. Born in Cairo in 985, he was the first of the Fatimid caliphs to be born in Egypt, the dynasty's new center of power. He ascended to the throne in 996 at the tender age of 11 and was controlled by powerful military commanders and eunuchs. However, he wasn't content being a pawn, and when he was 15, he arranged for the elimination of these powerful men who were controlling him. This brutality would be a defining feature of his reign as Fatimid Caliph, though there were significant contradictions in his personality. He founded a vast library in Cairo that offered instruction in religious topics as well as emerging sciences such as medicine and astronomy. Yet this same enlightened patron was also a tyrant of seemingly boundless eccentricity. He issued a dizzying array of bizarre edicts, many of which were later rescinded and then reissued. For instance, he banned the consumption of a soup that had been a favorite of his rival, and according to one source, he issued an edict banning Cairo's dogs from barking. Unfortunately, you probably don't want to know how the edict was enforced on the incessant barkers, and I'll save you these sad details. In another disturbing twist, he also persecuted Christians, Jews, and Sunni Muslims during his reign. He even went so far as to order the destructions of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, an act that would later be one of the inspirations for the Crusades. Notably, destroying sites associated with Jesus angered not just the Christian world, but the Islamic world as well, since he is held to be a great prophet in this religion. Al-Hakim also took it upon himself to execute his own advisors routinely for even slight shows of disloyalty. Simply put, Al-Hakim had made a very long list of enemies from a diverse range of political, social, and religious factions within his domain. Due to his completely unhinged behavior, he had become known as the Mad Caliph within his own lifetime, a moniker by which he is still remembered today. While the exact details of al-Hakim's final night remain shrouded in doubt, the historical consensus leans heavily toward one conclusion. He was likely eliminated in a carefully orchestrated palace coup. And at the center of this plot was the one person in the empire who was perhaps as formidable as the caliph himself, his older half-sister, the Princess Sit al-Mulk. Intelligent, wealthy, and politically astute, Sit al-Mulk had a deeply fraught relationship with her brother. She openly opposed his increasingly erratic and destructive policies, which she likely saw as a threat to the stability of the dynasty their father had built. Al-Hakim, in turn, was deeply paranoid and jealous of her influence, suspecting her of having lovers among his top generals. In an effort to curb her influence, he issued extreme edicts against women as a whole, though this appears to have just angered her even more. Their simmering conflict reached a boiling point in 1013 over the question of succession. Al-Hakim, in a shocking break with tradition, designated a distant cousin as his heir, completely bypassing his own young son, Ali. This was unprecedented, and for Sit al-Mulk, this was an unforgivable breach. Committed to preserving the direct line of succession, she took the young Ali and his mother into her own palace for protection, a direct and defiant challenge to the caliph's authority. This act transformed their personal rivalry into a full-blown dynastic crisis, and Sit al-Mulk had every reason to fear for her life, and every motive to act first. After the disappearance of her brother, she moved with stunning speed and precision to consolidate power. She distributed vast sums of money to court officials and military commanders to secure their loyalty. She quickly had her young nephew Ali crowned as the new caliph, with herself installed as the regent and de facto ruler of the entire empire. Then, in a final chilling move, she tied up the loose ends and had al-Hakim's chosen heir eliminated as well. Immediately after securing power, Sit al-Mulk began a complete political and social reset and quickly reversed all his edicts, especially related to religious discrimination. And yes, in case you were wondering, the dogs of Cairo were allowed to freely bark to their heart's content once again as well. Sit al-Mulk would effectively control the entire Fatimid Empire until her passing in 1023. Given that she had the most to benefit by far, and the most to lose by far, this Fatimid princess is believed by most scholars to be responsible for al-Hakim's disappearance. While this theory remains the most probable historical explanation, it's not the only one. The strange trajectory of al-Hakim's life and the lack of a body have allowed other powerful narratives to endure. The first alternative theory is that of voluntary abdication. This idea claims that al-Hakim, in his growing piety and asceticism, simply chose to abandon his throne and walk away from the world. This narrative is supported by the clear shift in his behavior during his final years. His rejection of royal finery for coarse wool, his preference for a simple donkey, and his solitary nocturnal meditations all point to a man increasingly detached from worldly power. While this theory struggles to account for the violent evidence of the injured donkey and stabbed robes, it presents a plausible end for a ruler who wanted to dismantle his royal identity. Others have speculated that he may have fallen to a threat that faced anyone in the Middle Ages: banditry. Under this theory, while he was traveling alone in humble clothing with a simple donkey, he may have been assailed by highwaymen. These individuals wouldn't have known he was the ruler of the entire Fatimid Empire, and may have mistaken him for a simple ascetic. When he was unable to pony up any goods, under this theory, they simply dispatched him to cover up any evidence of their attempted crime. His body was then simply lost to both the literal sands and the sands of time. In the end, We will never know for certain what happened to this caliph, who was, at his peak, one of the most powerful people in the medieval world. Personally, though, I like to apply Occam's razor to this situation, and it's very obvious that a certain princess benefited the most from his disappearance.